Hi there, and welcome to how to create a sign-in screen flow in Xamarin.Forms. My name is Chris van Wyk, and in this lightning lecture, we're going to have a look at creating a Xamarin.Forms application, which deals with a very common feature, which is allowing the user to sign in. Our goals for this session is as follows. First, we need to get to grips with our feature, which means understanding exactly what is meant by signing in to our mobile application. We then look at the Xamarin.Forms navigation building blocks available to us, which allows us to build this feature into our application. And then finally, we look at such an application implementing our sign-in feature. Before we jump into our feature, let's set the scene. It's a typical Friday afternoon, and we have started with the next sprint planning session. The development team is ready and the project owner is presenting the features for the next sprint. In his hand, he has the familiar bundle of feature cards, making up the top prioritized features for the next sprint. He clears his voice and says, guys, we talk about managing the user's friends and allowing for automated news updates last week in our backlog grooming. However, a decision was made to bump up our sign-in to the top of our list. This is an easy feature. You've developed this several times already in our web projects, and I think this is a quick win. Easy to implement 5-pointer story. Silence. And a cricket starts chirping in a cupboard at the back of the room. So in this objective, we'll look at the sign-in flow and pause for a minute or two to understand what the difference between authorization and authentication is. Because by the sounds of it, our product owner expects this story to be completed. So let's jump into this and see what is needed to get our application going. Let us go back to the sprint planning session and back to this so-called easy to implement sign-in feature. Right, we've all been here in one form or another. So it starts out with Bob that needs to be able to sign into the application so that he can use it. Now something that was disguised as a simple let's add a sign-in screen to our application has now become something that's going to career off the wheels. Because suddenly someone pipes up and asks, what if the user do not have an account? Or what happens if the user's account has been locked? And then we know this guy, the guy that sits in the back of the team, raises his hands and asks, what about access to the application when the user has forgotten his password? So if having no account is valid, so should be forgotten password. Let's look at this. It turns out that if Bob indicates that he has forgotten his password, Bob would then be able to request a password reset. This would kick off a system event that would send an email reset request to Bob. Bob would confirm this request, update his password, and then eventually be able to sign in again. So looking at this diagram taken down by the Scrum Master, the team is convinced that they are now tethering on the edge of a deep, dark rabbit hole, ready to dive in head first. So before we start solving our problem, let's talk about one aspect here, which is authentication versus authorization, since both these two concepts is going to come into play in our application. So let's talk about authentication and authorization, because we'll implement both of these two concepts in the application today. Authentication is the act of confirming the truth about an attribute of a single piece of data claimed true by an entity. And it turns out that there are a couple of authentication factors we could use. We could use knowledge factors, where we are going to rely on the user knowing both a username and password. Or we could rely on ownership factors. For example, there's an ID card or a software token. Or even we could look at inheritance factors. For example, what the user does or has, a fingerprint or a DNA sequence. Now, like I've mentioned, we're going to stick to authentication in terms of a username and password challenge in our application. However, authorization is also going to come in play. Authorization is the function of specifying access right to resources related to access control. So this is kind of interesting. It means that someone or some system is trusting me based on an authentication of some point and now grants me access to resources. So I don't want to delve deeper into these two concepts, but there's a distinct difference here which is important for our example. And like I've said, we'll implement both authentication and authorization. Based on our discussion so far, it is clear that we are dealing with authentication. However, we would be able to add authorization, and you can just hear this, it is going to come from the product owner. So what we'll need to plan for is some kind of authorization via one of these channels into our application. I want to park our flow diagram for a minute, and since the development team also decided it's time for a coffee break, talk about two components we have in Xamarin.Forms. The application main page property and page presentation styles. These two items will give us a couple of considerations towards our architecture and hopefully allow us to help our team to step back from the rabbit hole before they drop into it. First, we'll look at two page presentation models, modal pages and modal-less pages. Then we'll look at the Xamarin.Forms application main page property. This is not going to be an exhaustive coverage though, just enough to allow us to make a few decisions coding our new feature. Most of our feature is going to rely on navigation of some kind to perform presentation or dismissal of specific screens or pages in our application. When a page navigates to another, the page navigated from is pushed to the stack, and when the page goes back, it gets popped from the stack and the previous page is visible. Now both modal and modal-less pages are maintained with the stack concept. And this does raise the question, why would we have both modal and modal-less pages? Well, the thing to keep in mind is that these two styles differ based on platform, with the biggest difference existing on iOS and Windows 8.1, less so on Android and Windows Phone 8.1, and none on Windows Phone 8 Silverlight. So let's look at these two presentation types in more detail. Modal pages are generally used for the following reason. The application needs some information from the user, but does not allow the user to navigate back until said information has been captured. So the APIs that we'll be using to present and dismiss this page is the navigation push modal async and the navigation pop modal async methods. To work across all platforms, a modal page must provide its own user interface for navigating back to the previous page. Modal-less pages are generally used for standard forward and back navigation. For backwards navigation, the user uses the software or hardware provided back button as per the platform the app is running on. In these pages, we're not concerned about back navigation without completing any information or action that is required on the currently presented page. For these pages, we have the navigation push async and navigation pop async methods to manage forward and backwards navigation. At this point, you may be asking, why is this important? Well, knowing which interface to use to step through our sign-up flow is going to be quite important. Here are a few additional questions we may need to answer. For example, is there going to be a landing page? Do we allow the user preview access to the application instead of presenting sign in specifically as a screen directly? Or will the application be locked down and the user needs to directly log in to access any of the features? Do we allow sign in? Do we allow sign up? And would we provide any features like login via using something like Facebook? Once the user signs in or signs up, how do we navigate to the rest of the unlocked application? So deciding on combinations of modal and modal-less pages will determine how our application deals with the answers to the above. There's one more item we need to look at, and that's the application's main page property. For our sign-in feature, the only concept we need to keep in mind when talking about the application main page property is that this property is going to allow us to set the root page of the application. Now that's pretty obvious, but why is it so important? Well, think about this. You can create logic in your application class to display a different page depending on whether the user is potentially logged in or not. And this is done by setting the application main page property to the specific page that needs to be presented. So we now know that we can present pages in different ways. We can display them modally or modalless. We also know that we can swap out the main page of our application depending on some kind of condition. So let's revisit our sign-in flow diagram and set the boundaries of our application. This will allow us to identify the items that will be part of the mobile solution and the items managed by external infrastructure. There are a couple of touch points in our application that we'll need to deal with via external services and applications. Even though our developer team may have done sign-up several times via web applications, this is not a web application but a mobile application, and as such, detached from certain services. So let's talk about sign-in via. This is where we're going to use Facebook, for instance, and we're going to make use of Xamarin.Auth to create the sign-in with experience. Now, I'm not going to cover OAuth and the mechanics of OAuth, since we have two really exciting lightning lectures that cover this topic specifically. Sign up is the process that could be handled completely offline in this instance, either via a website or partially via the mobile application. Generally, this will include an API hosted on either a website as part of a cloud service, and the sign-up information requested here will need to comply with the various platform requirements. For example, Apple requires that apps that require users to share personal information, such as email address and date of birth, in order to function, will be rejected. And applications that include account registration or access a user's existing account must include a privacy policy or they will be rejected. So be careful when coding this experience in the context of iOS applications. The next item is reset password. Again, this is a process that will be partially instigated on the device or in your application, but the complete process is going to be completely managed by an offline service. Then we need to look at account locked. So an account locked is where the user has credentials and is trying to sign into the application using an API. So the result set here that's returned by the API is going to govern how the application will react. So a suggestion would be to return an HTTP result of 403, forbidden, indicating that the supplied credentials were valid but still were not enough to grant access. Now you could argue that the status code should rather return 401, unauthorized, to not give too much information back with login attempts. It is going to be all up to you. However, the intent here is to indicate that the account was locked. Right, so when presenting this view of the sign-up flow to our team, definitely changed a few heads in the team. We are now able to focus on what is going to be specific on our application and implement that. One thing again I would like to raise here is make use of the HTTP status codes to manage your application and API interaction. So let's take this forward and see how to implement it in our application. Let's look at our application first before we look at any code. I would like to show you what the application looks like and the behavior we're aiming for before we look at how we constructed the application. So this is a typical Xamarin.Forms application. You can see we have a PCL, a portable class library that defines all business logic and UI. And then we have two platform-specific projects. Right, so I'm going to start by looking at the iOS project. And here's the application up and running. So we've got a couple of concepts that we want to allow this application to portray to our user. The first is that the user has a preview into our application. So for this reason, the user is able to swipe through the initial 3 screens here to see what the application is all about. At that point, there's a Start Now button, which pressed will pause the user at a login screen. On this screen, we're going to allow the user to do a couple of things. First, you'll be able to sign in using a username and password challenge. Or the user could request a forgotten password action. So this is where the user forgets his password and requests a reset. Alternatively, the user could log in with a demo account just to see what the application is all about, or we could provide a login via Facebook. Now, this application does not provide a sign-up process. We're going to assume that our application is an add-on to an existing service, and for that reason, management of sign-up is done in a website. Let's have a look at the normal sign-in flow. So a typical user would provide us with his username and then password. And once provided, he'll then click on the sign-in button. So this would log the user in, and depending on your application's design, there may be a landing screen. Now we've decided to go with a master detail implementation here, which means we've decided that our application in terms of features for now will have a news page, a profile settings page, and then a logout option. In our news page, we're going to present a couple of news articles to our user to peruse, or once he or she chooses to change the settings, be able to update profile settings. Now this is just an example of what can be done, but we've decided to add in the user's image based on a Gravatar registration, provide notification updates, or allow the user to choose these notification updates, and then also change some personal information. At any point, the user would be able to tap on the Save button, and these choices would be persisted. Now once the user is done using the application, he or she are able to log out. This would log out the user and come back to our login screen. What happens if the user does not provide us with enough information? Well, if the user doesn't provide us with enough information, we're going to make sure to let him or her know that something went wrong. In this instance, a username and password is required. So this could mean the user forgot his password. Let's see how we can fix this. Now, there's two options. We can either choose to use the email address provided in the username field here, or if the user taps on forgot password, prompt for a username. In this case, username is an email address. So we'll say, please provide an email address. The user clicks on OK, and the request password action is put into place. So this is going to request a password from an external server. And then we're going to follow the flow of resetting the password via an email request. So this means that from this point forward, the application is going to wait for the user to check in mailbox, grab or reset the password inside a website, and then come back and log in. We're not going to manage it from within the application. Now, if the user decides, you know what, I just want to see what this application looks like via demo account access, we can click on the demo account button down here, log in, and this time around you'll see that we'll notify the user that access is now restricted to demo mode. So this means that there is no settings section for the user to update any of his or her settings. The user would be able to log out, and then we'll present the login screen again. The last option the user has on the screen is to log in via Facebook. So this is interesting because Facebook, the application or the implementation that we have for our application, is going to make use of Xamarin.Auth or the Xamarin.Auth component. So here we're going to present a view outside of our Forms application. So let's see what this looks like. I'm going to tap on the Facebook button here, and you'll see that now we have a modally presented view. So this modal would need me to provide some way of jumping back to our application. And I've actually done this. I've added a cancel button to this page that we have. So this view or this page is a custom page with a custom page renderer that is going to allow us to provide this interaction. So if I tap on cancel, you'll see it gets dismissed and the user can log in again. So let's complete this Facebook sign up, or sign in rather, and see what our application looks like. So I'm going to pause the video here and enter my credentials, and then I'll jump back to show you what it looks like. So I've just entered my credentials, so I should now be able to log in. You can see that I get the successful status here, and now I'm back into the application. In the News section, if I tap on the menu, you'll see there's a Settings section, and I'll be able to update my settings. So in the background, what we've now done is we've picked up the details about this user from his Facebook instance, and we present a profile picture. Now for me, both my Gravatar and Facebook pictures are the same, so you won't see a difference here. But you're welcome to have a look at the code to see how this is done. Again, the user would now be able to log out, and we'll have the login screen available to him or her. Now that we have had a look at iOS, let's have a quick look at Android. So our Android application is going to follow the same styling that we saw for iOS, but you may have noticed that this does look a little bit different. What I've done for Android is I've implemented the material design resources. So you may find that the resources folder does have a little bit more information that you may expect normally from a pure Xamarin.Forms application. So let's see, the behavior is exactly the same. The user can look at the preview of the application, tap on a start button, and then here we have a login screen. So we have sign in, and if the user enters something wrong, you can see platform specifically will present a toast. Now the user is able to log in, so I'm going to quickly log in as myself here. And once signed in, we'll see the same behavior. Again, the news page with the menu on the side with settings and logout. Settings here is styled Android specific. So I can set these sliders and they will set, or the switches rather, and they will set the properties as we have. Again with the save in the top right hand side. The user logs out, he or she logs out of the application, and the login screen is presented again. Now, in terms of the Facebook sign-in, this does work a little bit differently. With a custom renderer, we're going to need to present a new activity. So I'm going to tap on this Facebook button, and we'll present this activity to the user. Now in here, I will be able to log in as previously, but notice here that the behavior is a little bit different. So even though this is presented as an activity, we don't provide any backwards navigation. This is provided by the actual platform. So we'll use the back button to jump out of that Facebook sign-in activity to present our login screen. Now again, if I log in, we'll get the same behavior as what we saw in the iOS application. We'll be presented with our master detail page with the menu on the left hand side, and I will be able to go to settings. And again, we'll see the familiar profile picture show up with the settings as it was saved on the previous run. So let's log out and do one more thing. We'll use the demo account to quickly log in. Now we'll update the user that this is the demo mode and he or she only has news and logout to choose from. In terms of the forgotten password implementation, if the user taps on forgot password, he or she will be required to provide an email address, and then we'll follow the reset mechanics via email. Right, so this is the implementation on both platforms. Let's look and see what we've done here to get this right. We're going to start by looking at the app.xaml.cs file first. Inside this CS file, we have a few blocks of code. There's a Facebook authentication settings block, which houses or maintains all the settings required to log into Facebook. Then we have the demo identity. This is the person that will be signing in when we're in demo mode. And then we're going to present our main page. So presenting the main page has the following logic. If the user is logged in, then we're going to display the landing route and we'll pass in the demo status. So remember, we can log in two ways. We can either log in as a user or we can log in as a demo entity. If we're logging in as the demo entity, we're going to restrict the amount of menu options on the left-hand side, but the rest of the application's functionality will stay the same. Right, so this is one of the key items. So this is where we use the navigation or the application.mainPage property rather. So here we are able to swap in the pages to display. Now, if we are not going to display the logged in session, so we're not going to display the landing route page here, our master detail, then we need to display the preview page. So our user at this point has not logged in. Right, so we'll display the preview page. Our preview page I'd like to open up because this is an interesting page. This is a custom renderer and we're going to display a carousel, so a set of pages. If we look at the XAML for this page, you'll see that we have a couple of content pages, each presenting a bit of content. So this would be imagery. In our case, we have a placeholder, but you could display some specific information per page to display a feature in your app. On our last page, we'll present the button so that the user can click on it. Now, you'll see that I use a command here, which means that each of my pages are driven via view models. So for that reason, each of my pages will have a corresponding view model that sets up data and manages interaction. So a preview view model does have this doStart command. The doStart command is going to request present login as soon as the user taps on the button. Right, so now we have these previous screens. The user taps on start and then present login is going to set the main page now to the login page. So we physically swapped out the page currently being displayed. So you'll notice that this gets used quite a lot with this initial presentation of pages or deciding which page to be presented. In our login page, again, this has a login view model. So if we open this up, a couple of things happen. A lot of business logic actually resides in this login view model. So I'm going to scroll down a little bit. You'll see we have a do login, we have a do Facebook login, we have a demo login, and we have a forgot password command. So each of these will drop into the logic that manages those interactions on this page. So let's look at what happens when the user logs in. So when the user logs in, we're going to make sure that there is at least a username and password presented. If it has been presented, then we're going to simulate a login, let the user know that we're logging in, and then we'll go to present main page on our application page. So this is going to check the Boolean, are we logged in, and then present the actual application. All that we do here in addition to demo is to set that this user is now logged in and that it is not a demo account. For demo accounts, we'll just pass in is demo, but otherwise we'll present the application. In terms of forgotten password, we're just going to simulate a request, so nothing really happens in terms of code execution apart from presenting a dialog to the user. Obviously, at this point, you're going to have a service call to your API to make sure that reset process gets set up and executes as expected. The last item we have here is the Facebook login. Now you'll notice a couple of things is happening here. I'm going to, from the actual abstraction here, I'm going to request a modal presentation of this page. Right, so it means that when I present this application page, we're going to need to implement some kind of back navigation, at least on iOS. On Android, we will have the built-in back button, but it's still a modal presentation. So why did I not create a push async? Why didn't I use push async? Well, if I were to use push async, that would mean that I will need to wrap my page in a navigation page. And I don't want a back button specifically on my web view page on iOS, I want a cancel. I don't want the user just to press back. I want it to be a conscious decision to click on the cancel. And the reason for that is the user may be logging in and then realize, oh, let me click on that back button. With cancel, I can override that process. Right, so let's look at this Facebook login page. So the Facebook login page is really simplistic. We use a specific platform renderer to implement this. So let's have a look at that renderer for iOS. On iOS, this renderer, right, so let's have a look at the renderer for this page. Now, there's a difference between Android and iOS, so let me start with the Android renderer first, or at least the iOS renderer first. So in this renderer, the main thing to keep in mind here is that this is presented modally. So if we want to dismiss this page at any point in time, we're going to need to call the pop modal async method. You'll see that I'm doing it inside here. I'll set up my OAuth authenticator with all the parameters required to log into Facebook, or at least to access the graph at Facebook. Then, if the user logs in successfully, so it's a successful authentication, then we're going to go and request a bit of information about this user. So we'll request his ID, name, picture, and email address. Because we'll use this to populate some variables in our application to make sure it's the same user that we have, or to at least access data required from our backend using the same email address. But this is logic you'll need to deploy and implement into your application and your specific use of your app. So once this is complete, we're going to pop this page modally. We'll set the application as logged in, and then we'll present the main page again. So this is to make sure that the login screen doesn't show up and we have the actual landing page. So our master deal page. Now, in terms of setting up this implementation, we need to style this. So what I've done here is, once we've added this view controller to our actual view, we're going to need to grab the navigation item and set the left bar button item so that we have that cancel. So what I've done here is I've decided to add a cancel button as a left bar button item. Remember, this is a modal page, so it doesn't have a back button. I am able to override the left bar button item quite successfully, and then make the action or set the action for that tab to pop modal async as well. So this is the iOS implementation. Let's have a look at the Android implementation. So for Android, we pretty much have the same code, although it does change a little bit. Here, we are also going to pop this view modally. Remember, it also gets presented modally, but it does behave as if it was presented asynchronously without a modal, because we still have the back button to manage navigation. The big thing to keep in mind here is that here we're presenting an activity. And what I also had to do is I had to override the Xamarin auth implementation for this specific view that gets rendered. So you may have noticed that inside my project, I have an inclusion of the Xamarin auth Android version. And in our web authenticator activity, I've had to override the onBackPress method in this class. I would like to show you what happens here. Remember, this view gets presented modally. So in the original code that you'll find on GitHub, you'll see that onBackPress checks for allow cancel and onCancelled, but does not call the base onBackPress method. So let me run this application and show you what the effect of this is. So what will happen here is that this activity will get presented, but the back button won't dismiss it. So that's pretty much in tune what you'd expect from a modal view. So you can see here it gets presented, and I can tap on back and it won't get dismissed. But in my situation, in my application, I would like this view to be dismissible. Otherwise, what will happen is the user will need to log in. Even though he makes a mistake, he won't be able to get out of this view. So it would mean if the user forgot his user credentials for Facebook, he would need to restart the application, which in my mind isn't such a good user experience. So by implementing the base on back press here, we get the required behavior, i.e. if I don't remember my details or I don't want to log in via Facebook, I can back out of this activity by tapping back. And it's the same experience that we saw in iOS. That cancel button does the same. If I didn't implement the cancel button, the user would not be able to dismiss the Facebook login screen. Right, so I can say, well, okay, I don't want to log in via Facebook. Let me get out of that. Right, so this was a real whirlwind look at the code. I'm going to wrap up at this point in time. You are welcome to have a look at this code. There's quite a number of things going on here. For instance, I've got additional renderers for cells, entry fields. I'm also, like I've mentioned, using platform-specific styling to get the styling look and feel that we require. The app.xaml page, you'll see there's accent colors and background colors, and some of these needs to be set on specific renderers like our Facebook pages to get the same look and feel. Even though there's a lot happening in our application, the key to its implementation is based on three things. First, we're able to set the main page based on a condition. So if the user is not logged in, we'll display a sign-in screen. If the user is logged in, we'll then display the landing page and all functionality to the user. In terms of presenting pages either logged in or not logged in, we have two options. We can set the pages as modal or as modal-less. With modal pages, you are required to provide back navigation, but typically we'll use those pages to force the user to provide some details in terms of capturing data that is required before we can continue. With modal-less pages, we can set up a flow of additional pages where back navigation is provided. By choosing the proper style here, we are able to create quite a compelling experience to our user to manage preview, sign in, sign up, reset password, and even log in via some external service. I would like to wrap up this talk showing you this slide. This is a list of all the components used in this application, and you're welcome to dissect my code and make use of this where you see fit. So with this, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Hope to see you guys in future classes. Until then, take care. And from my side, goodbye.